And one more segment for this episode. This one's really going into a culture war issue that pisses me the frick off. I don't know if you guys know anything. Sorry, I feel like I'm a little more angry than I normally am on this episode.
A certain hand gesture with one finger.
So, I don't know if you guys know the YouTube channel. It's called Rising on the Hill, or Rising on the Hill YouTube channel. It's with Krystal and Saagar and Enjeti, I think. Basically, the way the show is framed is Krystal is a left populist, Saagar is a right populist. Now, you may have, if you listen to the show, you know I rail against the idea of a right populist. To me, it means absolutely nothing. And in fact, I'm going to play some clips from their show where they talk about Chinese influence in Hollywood movies. I'm going to try to debunk their culture war bait, but I think throughout it, Saagar spells out very clearly what a right-wing populist is, especially at the end, because he makes some remark about just like, they're like, oh, what solution could we have? And he's just like, ban it. Ban all Chinese interference, ban it. That's what that is the essential character of a right-wing populist, just this authoritarian streak.
Authoritarians who want to control us so that they can have us silenced.
But we'll get to that. I'm going to play some clips.
So these films are not only critical to the studio's bottom line, but to one of their most important relationships. That's the Chinese government. So the Federalist cultural reporter Emily Jahinsky recently wrote about Hollywood and Chinese cozy relationship and why 2020 could permanently change it.
Nope, not going to work.
So Emily joins us now via Skype to kind of discuss her piece. Good to see you, Em. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about this observation. I mean, something I've highlighted here now for a long time about how there's all this Chinese money that goes into these Hollywood studios, which creates this feedback loop because the Hollywood studios want to, please their funders, and they want to be able to enter Chinese markets, so they sometimes self-censor. Why will 2020 make it even worse?
What you say?
Yeah, I mean, I reported this story out in January, late December and early January, so it was right before things really got crazy in our relationship with China and with Hollywood's relationship with China. I mean, theater chains have been shut for months now, not just here in this country, but overseas, and that's creating like some incredible financial constraints for them. So it makes that Chinese market even more important to their bottom line.
In this clip, they just spell out the reason China has any input in Hollywood, and it's the bottom line. It's all about the money.
It's all about the money. It's all about the dum-dum-da-da-dum-dum. I don't think it's funny.
But it's interesting that they mention this right up top as just like a preamble to whatever angle they're gonna take. This is actually part of the conservative worldview. For whatever reason, they acknowledge economic underpinnings when they want to. They know that it's there, but they dismiss it as just kind of like a political footnote, when it's the whole note. It is the note. They know the economic underpinnings are there, but they just kind of don't care. And they made it clear in this clip that they get it, but they ignore what they get and just go straight for the culture war bait.
And why we should be concerned that the Chinese market is so important to their bottom line is because it means that they censor scripts. In the story that I reported out, I talked to a Hollywood executive. His name is Chris Fenton, who mentioned that actually some of these scripts are censored before they're even written. Scriptwriters in Hollywood know now not to make China the enemy of any movie, and to include certain things in their films or not. I mean, Bohemian Rhapsody was censored just last year. Some of the gay part of the storyline were taken out so that it could be shown in Chinese theaters. So that's where you see this relationship with China becoming problematic. And also, let's remember, Hollywood doesn't want to do business in the state of Georgia after they publish, after they pass an anti-abortion law. Well, okay, the Chinese government has repressing Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps.
Right.
So there's
And
all
stealing
kinds
their
of
kidneys, but that's fine.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, who cares about that?
Stealing kidneys? Really, bro? Like, you're just gonna regurgitate Falun Gong talking points? That is so lame, dude.
You've memorized a bunch of talking points.
Anyway, a couple things about this clip. First, I'll get it out of the way. Yeah, China does have control over content in Hollywood movies. I'm not denying that, and I don't really have any incentive to deny it. It's just true. I mean, well, they at least have control if the movies are going to be released in China. But what they never mention they actually do mention this at the end, we'll get to that. But what they barely mention is the US government, American capitalists, and the American dominant class have way more control over Hollywood than China has. Their only real aggrievement is they want American movies to be controlled by American capitalists and to have American propaganda. She also brings up the example of Bohemian Rhapsody and does a sleight of hand. So, Bohemian Rhapsody was censored in China, but it was not censored in America. I repeat, she claims they took gay scenes out of Bohemian Rhapsody to appease China. In reality, America and most of the world released the full version. Big thunder. I'm in a thunderstorm right now. So, as I was saying, they took the gay scenes out of Bohemian Rhapsody to appease China, but those were not taken out of every version of the movie. She makes it seem like they took those scenes out of the whole movie, every movie, like those scenes don't exist anymore to appease China. But in reality, an American will likely never see the censored version. They have no reason to. This seems like a purposeful sleight of hand because when the movie came out, there was a backlash in the gay community against Bohemian Rhapsody. And the reason is the movie, in general, de-emphasized Freddie Mercury's sexuality, and that's before any Chinese censorship. They completely de-emphasize Freddie Mercury's sexuality and even portrays gay sex as the sort of tempestuous sin that he becomes allured by. So it's not a particularly pro-gay movie. Wow, I don't know if you hear that, but it's hailing right now too. Wow. But so what Emily Jahinsky is trying to vaguely do here, vaguely tie the controversy about the movie's portrayal of gay people into her grievance about the Chinese government. She's trying to tie these together, make you think they're connected, so that China becomes the target of queer grievances, not America. When in reality, it was Western movie makers who decided to de-emphasize the homosexuality element of the movie at all, and then China just took out the little bits that they did leave in the movie. And on top of all of that, within China, the censorship was criticized. Chinese movie fans were vocally and publicly opposed to the change. They want to make it out like this amorphous Chinese mob all hate the gays and force us to take gay people out of our movies. When that's just not true at all. Chinese people did not like this change. Chinese moviegoers. Also, the idea about Hollywood not filming in Georgia. That really doesn't mean anything. It's pure just deflection. Yes, there were movie studios who said they wouldn't film in Georgia to protest their anti-abortion laws. But it really doesn't matter because Georgia is still one of the biggest states for film production. So what she's really complaining about is not the material reality of where the Hollywood industry films, but rather she's just complaining about liberal hypocrisy. And I'm increasingly more and more convinced that your average American conservative is only conservative because of liberal hypocrisy. It always comes back to that for them. Your average dumb conservative wouldn't believe most of the shit they believe if they weren't like, oh, Bernie Sanders flew in a plane, but he wants to take away my plane? What? That's not fair. Hypocrites.
Attention all libtards. Farted and I had an accident in my pants.
And finally, I just have to make the obvious point that there's a difference between Hollywood pre-editing themselves to make sure their movie can be released in a foreign market and not filming somewhere. There's really no parallel between Georgia's role in Hollywood and China's role in Hollywood.
Right.
Well, and I think that's part of it too, is it's easy to underplay just how much this changes not only the content of the films, but which films are even greenlit to start with because of how important and how large the Chinese market is. So just talk a little bit about that piece of it.
Yeah, so there's a quota as to how many films, American films, can be showed at the Chinese box office in a given year. But what that means is Hollywood has incentive to pour a lot of money into movies that they know will be shown in China and will do well in China. And you know, this is in certain cases we see, you know, American films targeted to certain demographics in this country that they know will come out to the box office and make decisions, artistic decisions because of that. But at the same time, I mean, the film industry, American film, has such a proud history of political expression. And this is one of the most important political topics right now is our relationship with China. And in the world is China's relationship with its own people. It's totally off limits to Hollywood right now unless it's venerating the Chinese government. Totally off limits.
There's a lot of contradictory points here. For one, like she said, there's a quota on Hollywood movies that get theatrical releases in China. There's only supposed to be 34 foreign movies released in Chinese theaters a year. Some years it's higher, like I saw in 2017 it was 40. They do bend the rules, but you get the idea. Not all of those movies are Hollywood movies, all of those 34. So let's say 30 Hollywood movies are released by conventional methods in China per year. You would presume that very few movies even try to crack the Chinese market. In other words, why are there more than 30 movies a year catering to China if they won't even be allowed there?
That's foreign movie.
If there are more than 30 or 40 or so movies a year that cater to Chinese audiences, that's a Hollywood problem, not a China problem. They're trying to get something that they may or may not get. And even if they don't get it, we still get a presumably, but I'm not convinced, a so-called inferior product. The issue is, Hollywood creates movies with as broad of an appeal as possible. Pretty common sense, right? And the reason they're increasingly making more bad movies isn't China. It's because bad movies have mass appeal and therefore make a lot of money. This only becomes apparent when China has different tastes in bad movies than we do. For example, Transformers: Age of Extinction and Warcraft made a lot of money, a lot more money in China than North America. And people blame the Chinese market for liking these shitty-ass movies. However, well, I take that back. I actually thought Warcraft was a pretty good movie. I mean, I am a fan of the Warcraft universe, but I didn't see why it was so hated. I'd watch it again.
You are not prepared.
However, those same people don't complain when the Avengers movies succeed at a similar level in both Chinese and American box offices. I consider that just as crappy of a movie as freaking Transformers. But we don't talk about it that way because white people like Avengers as well as Chinese people. And then similarly, there are some bad movies like the Disney Star Wars movies. I really wanted to emphasize that. The Disney Star Wars movies suck. But they actually do terribly in China. People in China don't like the Disney Star Wars. But we don't blame Americans for liking crap movies. This creates a dynamic where whenever a bad movie does well in China, the American press sneers at China for their crappy taste, but whenever a bad movie doesn't do well in China, it is either underreported and ignored, or in fact also turned against China.
One of the things that makes me really sad about this is that the movies that get greenlit are these, stuff blowing up, things, the jokes have to make sense on a very baseline level because they have to appeal to a non-American audience. And it creates kind of like a mass consumerist culture. And it kind of removes kind of the things that made them American in the first place, which is that films in which the whole country could rally around. And now it's made for world consumption, which just kind of dilutes that. What impact do you think that has on all of us? Because I think film is really important.
Here, Saagar shows his authoritarian ass by making it clear that he actually wants American movies to be American propaganda. He wants movies to be something that Americans rally behind. Saagar, he's kind of right that American movies are made for world consumption. But where he's wrong is that's how Hollywood always has been. American movies are and have been one of the most ubiquitous cultural exports in the world. Movies aren't made for non-Americans any more than they were in like the 70s. They were still making movies for international audiences in the 70s. People worldwide were seeing American movies a lot. The difference is there's a lot more money to be made in international audiences now. And the even bigger difference than that is there's now national film industries to compete with Hollywood. So if Chinese movies speak to Chinese audiences more than American movies, then Hollywood, as a capitalist institution, isn't making that sweet money. It's all about the money.
It's all about the money. It's all about the dum dum da da dum dum. I don't think it's funny.
Yeah, that's another really good point. It's like you mentioned, the jokes. They have to be able to land in Chinese movie theaters, which makes it a totally different experience. For the people who are making these movies, of course, they have to now think about not just what Americans are going to laugh at. And this isn't for every movie, but it's for a lot of movies, and especially those big budget films where a lot of money is poured into, like Mulan is a very good example. Disney is in a really tricky situation because they put a lot of money into Mulan. They tried to gear it towards Chinese audiences in a way that would make them a ton of money in the Chinese box office. But even then, there's been controversy about whether they did that correctly. So probably the most prominent controversy with this right now is with Top Gun. Is it a huge deal to the artistic integrity of the film that they took the Taiwanese flag off of Maverick's bomber jacket? No, you probably wouldn't notice it if it wasn't pointed out by conservative media. But at the same time, it's a matter of principle. This is one of the biggest issues when we talk about our relationship with China, Hollywood's relationship with China. Our Pentagon spent a lot of, collaborated with the makers of Top Gun. And then they took the Taiwanese flag off the bomber jacket. The Pentagon uses Hollywood movies as training exercises and PR in some cases, and that collaboration I think is extremely problematic. So is it a big deal that the Taiwanese flag isn't on Maverick's bomber jacket? No, but there's other things that we're not even noticing because we don't know what's getting left on the cutting room floor, or even not even, like, this is the scariest thing, is what people aren't even putting into their scripts, the ideas that they aren't even coming up with because they know it will never get greenlit by a major.
So in this clip, they just outright acknowledge that the Pentagon interferes in Hollywood, and Emily Jahinsky doesn't have any issue with it. In fact, she frames it as if the Pentagon and Chinese government are collaborating to make movies. Ooh, isn't that a scary cabal? Which is just the most absolute joke of an idea ever. It's more like the Pentagon and the Chinese government and dozens of other forces all have an input into the movie making process. Some of these forces have more influence on some movies than others. Most movies are never touched by either the Chinese government or the Pentagon, and in fact, virtually no movies are influenced by both China and the Pentagon. I mean, there are superhero... I actually don't know that for sure. I don't know. The extent of all this isn't that public or even that measurable, but the idea that they're collaborating, the Pentagon and the China are collaborating to make American movies shittier is just the most like dog crap for brains take I can imagine. And then the obvious thing I have to point about this, the first Top Gun movie is an absolute garbage trash movie, and that was made way before China had any influence in Hollywood.
Really
But what is honestly the answer here? Because, I mean, we're focused on China. I think that's important because that's a significant global issue that affects our politics here and geopolitics all around the world. But what you're really describing is just capitalism. I mean, playing to the mass market, the lowest common denominator. You know, I thought Trolls 2, which was Trolls 1 I actually kind of liked. Trolls 2 was a terrible movie. And yet it does amazing because it hits this point of like, you know, it's sort of accessible and bubblegummy for everyone. So like, what is the answer to that?
Yeah, so my perspective is that the answer is more capitalism. And I would encourage American consumers to start making their demands known and saying, you know, I'm not going to go to Top Gun 2 if you take the Taiwanese flag off the bomber jacket.
I knew this. I knew her libertarian streak was coming. I have another idea. Ban it. Ban it.
Well, Ted Cruz is trying to. He's a conservative. Ted Cruz is trying to prevent the Pentagon from working on films where there's censorship on behalf of the Chinese government. The Chinese censors have to look at scripts and everything before the movies are shown in the Chinese box office. So Ted Cruz does have a bill, which I support. I think that's an important bill. But I would also just encourage American consumers to not patronize movies that are going to do this BS.
So by the end, we're left with three basic ideological positions about how to go forward. Krystal Ball rightfully points out more or less what I've been getting at, namely that this is just the natural consequence of capitalism. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Saagar shows his authoritarian ass again, where he just wants it banned, which is like, okay, dude, cool idea, whatever. And then Emily Jahinsky says more capitalism is the answer, which I take it back. That is way more of a dog crap for brains take than even her last one. There's no possible explanation of how that could be true. If you're claiming capitalism will solve this quote-unquote issue, it really just shows you don't understand what capitalism is. But let's take that claim on face value. What she's advocating for is the middle class becoming radicalized in a consumer sphere. I want to talk about the nature of the middle class more in depth at some point, but for now I'll just explain a little bit what I personally mean by that. The middle class in the United States is disappearing. We all know that. Many people who are very poor even identify as middle class because they still prescribe to, well, I mean, usually it's because they're naive, or they still prescribe to socio-economic paradigms from like the 70s. So, because of that, since the middle class is now so small and people choose to identify it to convey a point rather than it just being informed by income most of the time, practically speaking, the middle class are working class people who identify more as consumers than they identify as workers. She's advocating for she's advocating for people becoming politically activated, but politically activated as a consumer. So her idea of using capitalism to counter Chinese influence in movies is pretty simple. It's see movies that don't have influence from China and don't see movies that do have influence from China. But that's not even a political act. That's just simple consumer preference. But middle class people can't conceive of actual disruptive political acts. They hardly even can conceive of politics. It's all just culture to them.
You're a culture war warrior.
This mentality is obviously detrimental to advancing working class causes. But by all means, please, if you're a conservative and listening to this, please stop saying movies made for China. The movie industry will become infinitely better if you stop watching Marvel movies. But the real irony of all of this is we all know these ineffectual and pointless capitalist-loving chuds are absolutely going to continue to see the same dumb movies. It's just the most hollow political gesture possible to be like, oh, your consumer choices will stop Chinese influence in American movies. No, it's not going to stop anything because the Chinese market, if it's not already, is already bigger than the United States. Sorry to tell you that, folks, but Hollywood is not making movies for us anymore. And it will remain that way as long as capitalism exists. And then, so on top of the fact that her idea of political activism is just the most hollow crap ever, the truly ironic part is everyone knows no one's going to follow through with her advice. These dumbasses are just going to keep seeing the same shit movies over and over again. They are the ones who see those movies. In this situation, you could say I'm defending Hollywood and China, although I'm really not. I'm just simply saying that this is not a cultural issue, it's an economic issue. Even me, who's in that position, I don't watch these stupid freaking movies that they're talking about. But they do, and they have an issue with it. So what the hell's going on? They just want to complain. And then, just to close out, then they talk about Ted Cruz's bill. Basically, Ted Cruz would prohibit the Pentagon from working on a movie that China is also working on. This is an actual potential solution. I mean, it's a dumb solution, but it's a lot more well considered than stop watching bad movies and then we'll change the world together. Yay! Sorry. I feel like I have a really ticked off attitude this episode, but I think the U.S. perpetually overestimates its true cultural power at the moment. And I think if Ted Cruz made Hollywood into a turf war between the Pentagon and China, well, China is going to win a lot more than Ted Cruz thinks it will.